Hello, a very warm welcome, and it's great that you're here on this very sunny and special afternoon. It's a very beautiful day. First of all, I'd like to say, well, my name is Cristina Nord. I'm working with the Ghoete-Institut here in Brussels, and I have the great pleasure and the honor to have this masterclass today with Christoph Hochhäusler. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Cinematek for making this possible. And of course, a very, very big thank you, a heartfelt thank you to Christoph for being here and for showing his films, but not only his films, he also curated a program called Heimkommen, eine Tendenz im deutschen Film, which is, in English it would be coming home, a tendency in German cinema or in German film, which will start tonight, as well as the series of his films, which will start tonight at 7, and then at 9 there's going to be the screening of Alexander Kluge's Abschied von gestern. I'm not familiar with the international title.
Yesterday Girl.
Yesterday Girl, thank you. The masterclass is going to be mainly about your work, and I prepared a lot of questions, and we'll see how far we get. If you have something you want to say, if you have a question to ask, please feel free to interrupt, to give us a sign, and then there will be, I think there will be a mic, which is necessary. Please wait for the mic to arrive. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Christoph, who was born in 1972, and he did study architecture before he moved on to study film in Munich. And I think already while you studied, you co-founded a magazine which is of a certain importance in Germany and in film discourse. The magazine is called Revolver Film. It exists in a print version and also online. And it is special because it's mainly about filmmakers reflecting their work. It's not so much film criticism or the traditional film, the traditional form of public publication about film, but mostly filmmakers talking about their work, long discussions, long interviews with filmmakers. Yeah. So that was while you were studying in Munich, and your first feature film was released in 2003. The German title is Milchwald. The international title is In This Very Moment. It was followed 2 years later in 2005 by Falscher Bekenner. I Am Guilty is the international title. This is a film we are going to show here in the framework of the series of your films. It's also a film we are going to see a couple of clips during this masterclass if everything goes well. Then there was a short in 2009, Séance, called Séance. It was part of a compilation called Germany 09. It was a film in which I think 13 German filmmakers reflected upon the state Germany was in at that given moment in 2009, 2008, 2009. And it was also a loose, it tried to establish a loose link to another famous compilation film made in the 70s, which was called Deutschland im Herbst. And again, I'm not familiar with the international title, probably Germany in Autumn or something like that, which was sort of like a famous compilation film in which...
I think the correct term is omnibus film, because it's like... People get, you know, it's okay. Like short
omnibus,
films
yeah.
tied together. Yeah. It's not.
Alexander Kluge and Rainer Werner Fassbinder were among the directors. Volker Schlöndorff also were taking part in Deutschland im Herbst. And in Germany 09, it was among others Romuald Kamaka, Angela Schanelek, and you. And then in 2010, there was Unter dir die Stadt, The City Below, and in a year later you took part in a trilogy, in a TV movie called Drei Leben, Again, I'm not familiar, I didn't find the international title, so you have to help me with that if there is an international title. It would be, literally translated, would be something like 3 Lives.
I think they kept the German.
Okay, okay. And there was you taking part, but also Dominik Graf and Christian Petzold. And last but not least, the very beautiful film that was released in 2014, Die Lügen der Sieger, The Lies of the Victors. And there are really a lot of things we could start with, talking about your oeuvre, talking about your work. I think I would like to start with something I find very remarkable in your work, and that is the special way you treat the space, the cities where the film is set, and the architecture. And I would like to discuss this a little bit in detail, and before doing that, I would like to show one excerpt from The City Below. It's mostly a business meeting, so it's mostly businessmen talking talking with each other. It's in German. We don't have subtitles, but I think it's not such a big thing because it's mainly about how you explore the space and how you explore sort of like the space which is inside and at the same time the space outside. And before I say more, I'm going to show you the clip.
Ja, bitte mir bitte folgen. Darf ich vielleicht etwas zu trinken bringen? Ein Aperitif vielleicht?
Wasser.
Ja, für mich auch. Bitte sehr gerne.
Eine heiße Zitrone, bitte. Hartmut.
Olaf, hallo. Herr Dertlen von der Success Resource.
Danke.
Herr Salman vom Legal.
Nehmen Sie doch Platz.
Tut mir leid, dass ich am Telefon nicht konkreter werden konnte.
Auf jeden Fall haben Sie mich neugierig gemacht.
Wir haben heute eine schöne Seezunge mit Wildreis und dazu würde ich gerne einen trockenen Riesling servieren.
Wir warten noch einen Augenblick.
Gerne. Herr Dertlen?
Wir planen einen großen strategischen Zukauf, der uns national zu Nummer 2 macht und europaweit vom Volumen her unter die ersten 5 bringen wird. Allerdings ist das Zeitfenster sehr eng.
Es handelt sich um Graf.
RNB will Graf übernehmen?
Ich weiß, was Sie denken, aber natürlich versucht Kleiber den Eindruck zu erwecken, dass das Closing perfekt sei.
Sicher sind erst 12, 13%.
Aber die Braut ist unglücklich.
Das kann man laut sagen.
Wir passen einfach besser zusammen.
Ehrlich gesagt, wir sind scharf auf die Entwicklungsabteilung von Graf.
Die brennenden Fragen sind jetzt erstens, wie viel ist Graf wirklich wert?
Das heißt zweitens, wie viel müssen wir im Endeffekt bezahlen?
Und wie finanzieren wir das Ganze, ohne dass es wehtut?
Das wollen wir von Ihnen wissen.
Es wird ein bisschen scheppern. Aber probieren wir es.
Maybe I should start and say hello. I'm sorry, I should have said that before. I'm very happy to be here, thank you. And I'm extremely happy to be in Brussels. We were just strolling through the city, and it's absolutely amazing to me. I swear I will make a film here. Anyway, coming to this complex of space, the treatment of space, and what's that for me? Well, I think we are all experts in space because we are raised with a very fine-tuned sensibility what space means. Not only in terms of, I'm mainly talking about social space now. For example, this distance is actually too far for the, I mean, we have this feeling that this is too far. We wouldn't know what's too close. So we judge people by their, if you see a group, if you go and you see how people are distributed in space, so to speak. We have immediately we have an idea of what's happening because of positions in space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think space is basically immediately a drama we are reading, and this is of course very interesting for cinema, because this is something we can reproduce and question and intensify and so on. I mean, to give you a very easy example, I mean, in cinema, space is different than in real life. I mean, to stage a kiss scene, depending on the ratio you're using in shooting, you have to move people closer than they would be in real life. I mean, especially if you, I mean, the old films are like 3:4 screen ratio. You would have to put the people much closer together than it's real in life. Now with a widescreen, you can have almost a natural distance. What I'm saying is that we are all experts in reading spaces, and I think in cinema today, space is underdeveloped most of the time, which I regret, because I think it's such a big thing for us. I mean, if we go to a place for the first time, in what corner are you comfortable? You know, I mean, it's so important in our daily lives. So this is why I'm so curious about space. And if we look at I don't know, I don't want to maybe that's too far reaching, but one of the major changes in how we conceive space in architectural terms in the last century was the conception of space in modernism, which is basically interested in breaking the boundaries of inside and outside. And one of the major means of that is, of course, technological. It's glass and steel, you know. So this modernism, the concept of modernism in architecture, brought us this idea of transparency. And the scene we've just seen is very much about that. I mean, there's this promise of transparency, and we still have this hope that transparency will bring us accountability, and it will bring us democracy or something. But now we already know that this promise was broken a long time ago, and I think in Brussels you have plenty of opportunities to see that this promise of open this opening up of boundaries has been broken and has been turned around, maybe even into a controlled space. So now glass is not any longer something that gives you the comfort to see what's inside, but it makes you aware that others are watching, and you're being watched, and you watch, and you're being corrected by the gaze of others and machinery and so on and so on. So it's a bit complex. I mean, I'm not saying that the scene is about all that, but those are thoughts that come to my mind when I see this.
I think the idea of having glass and the notion of transparency, but at the same time there's something going on which is totally opaque, because it's sort of like an insider deal or something like that, comparable to that. That is very fascinating. But I also had the feeling that it's very fascinating because you can see, on the one hand it's glass and there is the promise of transparency, but on the other hand it's sort of like in the 20th or 30th floor. That means it's unreachable. It's very far away from the ground. And sort of like after the last cut, when you have the camera outside, you wouldn't even be able to tell where the camera is, maybe in a building which is opposite on the 30th floor, but I don't know exactly. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this, the factor of the altitude. And there's, for instance, this one shot where you can see sort of like a perspective like that. It's for a brief moment. You have like the head of one of the guys, and then it's sort of like this perspective. When I read, I think I read something by Ulrich Pelzer, who co-worked on the script, a famous German writer, with whom you've been working together for a while now. And he said that while you were doing research in Frankfurt, among the bankers in Frankfurt, among the financial people working there, you were invited to a bank, to one of the high rises of, I think it was the German bank, I don't know exactly, and that there was sort of like a toilet, very, very like in the 50th floor, and that the toilet was a toilet for men, and it was constructed in a way that people would urinate, and it gave them the impression to urinate on the city.
It's Commerzbank Tower.
Commerzbank, okay. And that is something very drastic image. Your film does not include this image. I thought maybe because it's sort of like it would be far too drastic for a film of yours, but still you work on that relationship between the ground and the altitude.
Yeah, we thought about it, but it's too close to a caricature. I thought, but it's true. I mean, I think if you, I mean, what's banking about? Banking is basically about abstraction. You have an economy, and you have to, through mathematics and other means, you reduce those processes that are quite complex, basically to numbers, and that's how you can abstract them, and that's how you can sell them and so on. And I think it helps enormously if you are in the 30th floor, because then city life is also an abstraction. You know, it becomes a model city, and it's much easier to deal with models when you decide to sell a company and affect so many lives. You don't want to see the street level, you know, because the street level is blood and sweat and tears and so on. And in the higher you are up, the less real the whole thing becomes. So it's really about fiction in the end. In the end, it's about fiction. In banking is like storytelling. I mean, their narratives are different than mine, but it's also everything is going to be fine. You're going to make a nice profit, and we will be able to control what's happening. I mean, this is the story that bank is selling, and it's much easier to sell that story if you're not on street level.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very interesting what you said, that banking is fiction in a way. It's also about suspension of disbelief, and there are moments of crisis when this suspension of disbelief doesn't really work any longer. And I think your film was shot and you had the crisis of 2008 as a background, but then again, it's not a film about the financial crisis, but still there's sort of like it's the background. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that also, because I think it must have been quite a task and quite a challenge to find ways how to make this kind of work visible.
I mean, I think that might be the biggest challenge in cinema today, that most of, I mean, what cinema can show is bodies in motion. And the forces that shape our world today don't seem to be bodies in motion anymore. Which what I'm talking about is machinery, algorithms, cables, wires, all kinds of system dependencies that are not, at least not in a very practical sense, visible. I mean, you might see a server farm somewhere, and you know that in the server farm there's the biggest investment fund of the world, you know, but all you see is fences and machines, and you don't see what's happening. So the black boxization of our world is a problem for cinema, because cinema is the conspiracy that everything could be visual. I mean, it's actually the promise that you can show the world. And I think one of the problems of our time is that we still believe in that promise, that we can show the world, while we can't. So I would say that we should develop a new kind of allegorical mode in cinema, which has been there in the 30s and 20s and 30s much more than it is. I mean, in a way, I think we are lost in this semi-naturalistic mode. Most of, especially art cinema, is now occupied with, because we are dealing with things that are like Greek mythology. You know, I mean, like the workings of the stock exchange is closer to the Greek mythology than it is to traders on the trading floor. You know, I mean, there's nothing to see. I mean, you basically don't understand where the power lies if you show traders, or you show cables, or you show the maintenance worker. You know, I mean, this. So we try to find ways to make it visible and make it sensual and in a non-realistic or non-naturalistic way. It sounds much too highbrow now, probably, talking about this. But when I have to say that when I write, also when I write together with Ulrich, it's 90% is intuition. I mean, we follow images, ideas. That it's all around. It's centered on situations that we find strong, and then the reflection on those situations and those images is the next step, so to speak. I don't think you can design a film out of your own understanding. It's more like you design the understanding after you have produced material that is basically coming out of you in a way that is beyond your knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, because I guess that's one of the fundamentals of filmmaking, that you have a material and the material might not do what you wish for. It might be reluctant, it might do all sorts of things, and then you can either try to control it harshly, but I guess then you're sort of like very close to failing, or you can sort of like go with it. That is something I would say. I'd like to get back for a second to something you said before, which I really find very interesting, because when you say that you really want to leave the framework of realistic filmmaking, I think it's something you can strongly sense when you see a film of yours, that there's something which goes beyond a realistic approach, definitely. I think we will show some examples for that later. But maybe you could sort of like elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think it's so crucial in your work, how you do that, how you, for instance, when you started to work on The City Below, what crossed your mind in that direction?
Well, I mean, of course, a lot of this has to do with my passions in cinema, and my passions in cinema are very diverse, I guess, but they are most enticed by films of the 30s and 40s, I guess, where abstraction in storytelling was a much more common thing. And allegorical storytelling was a much, or at least looking at it from today, it seems to be like that. But of course it's impossible to just reproduce what has been done. So to give you an idea what I dream of, I don't know if I will ever achieve it, but what I dream of in cinema is a cinema that is basically maybe like molecular kitchen today, like this molecular cooking, where you have integrates that are super pure and have no relation to each other, so to speak, but by being tasted and digested, they become a sensation inside your system. So the spectator is of crucial importance in this process. So you don't like if you cook like the traditional meal, it would be like naturalistic. Everything is in harmony, and the including the icing on the cake and so on. And if you have this molecular concept, then the spectator becomes really a much more important part of the creation. And my dream of a contemporary cinema would be that, because we are so cultured about cinema now, we know so much, we have seen so many films, that it's much more abstract than what we are used to. And it becomes concrete and sensual by watching it, by putting it together in your head. So my dream will be to make films, and it's far off, but I'm just saying that this is something I would be very much interested, that are only bits and pieces, and by seeing them, they transform into a story that we have to find,
I find that is a very beautiful description of what you do, because in fact I have the feeling that a lot of moments, a lot of scenes and sequences in your films require a very active way of looking at them, and a very sort of like developing your own imagination and your own fantasies about what's happening. I have to think a little bit about which clip I show that goes in that direction, but before I do so, I would love to show another one from The City Below, which is towards the end of the film. And the film is set in Frankfurt, and it's a scene which sort of like does not really or is not really connected to the rest of it. But however, I think the fact that it's not totally connected to the storytelling, for instance, makes it very special and also very characteristic. And yeah, I'm going to look for it. 1 second.
Through the work with the film magazine I'm editing for 18 years now, together with friends, I have come to the conclusion that you should never trust a director.
This is like a very brief interlude before the last scenes, the last moments of the film, and it's really like a little bit like an interruption. And I think in your most recent film, The Lies of the Victors, you have something similar. I think even twice with Berlin. Yeah, maybe you could explain a little bit your approach, even though you just said don't believe the director. However.
I said I don't trust him.
Don't. Okay.
Is this a
one question between? Do you think it's necessary not to trust the director because?
Could you please wait for the mic? Because if we don't wait for the mic, it won't be registered. Thank you.
Did you just put the emphasis on don't trust the director because, as what you said before, so much intuition is in the process, and so much going on where you even self are not aware of? Is this the reason, or are there other reasons as well?
Well, because I think talking about something creates a known level of reality, and it's not necessarily connected to the work. And to know what you've done is very complicated, I think. And that's why I said that. But it's half tongue in cheek, you know. I mean, I'm trying to understand what I'm doing, but one of the reasons why I think criticism is so of vital importance is that directors usually don't understand what they're doing. I mean, not in a complete way, at least. So I say that to encourage anyone in the audience to stick to their own impressions and not, you know. I mean, often directors are being asked, "Is that right? That this film is about so and so?" And I don't think a director is in the position to say yes or no to such a thing. Just to clarify this concept, why I like this kind of, because I think basically the things in this world are looking at us too, and how is this Marx word, that the material world forms our conscience, and this is of course something I haven't invented. I mean, one of my favorite films of modernist filmmakers is Liklis by Antonioni, and it ends in this beautiful sequence, 9 minutes long, where there's no characters but a street and a street corner and the lamps going on, and you just see a still life, and it's as meaningful or even more meaningful than when we see the characters in the film. So I mean, I think it's one of the premier capabilities of cinema to let things speak, so to speak, and people. I mean, there's so many cinemas that do that. I mean, among others, Ozu with his pillow shots, so-called pillow shots. Because I think basically buildings and streets and all the artifacts we produce are like crystals of time that reflect on how we are, what we think is important, who is in power, and so on. So objects are really speaking to us.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really something which is very strong in your work, that nearly every interior, nearly every room, and the way the camera captures the room tells something without pushing it too much. And I think that is something quite difficult to achieve that, because things can be very telling on first sight. Like, for instance, if you had shot a scene like the one I was talking about, what you had seen during your research, the toilet situation at Commerzbank, that would have been super obvious. But you find sort of like far more subtle solutions, and I think that is something really very strong and remarkable.
Thanks. I mean, I see a lot of films that try to narrow down every object in a master-slave relation to the plot, so to speak, because they want to have a very effective storytelling and so on. And sometimes I enjoy that, but I don't. I think cinema can be much richer if it's less rigid in that way, and if, for example, the unknown or the undecipherable plays a part. I mean, if a city is a perfect example. I'm fascinated with cities because a city like Brussels is full of signs we don't fully understand anymore because it's from another time. So we have forms that I mean, we basically have the presence of signs and forms and images that go back thousands of years, and we don't. Many of them we don't fully understand, or not on a conscious level, but they are still there, and they're still sending, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I think good communication includes failed communication, in a way.
Mm-hmm. So these buildings we just saw try to communicate something, but we might not be able to understand them or to grasp them, but still we have the feeling of their presence. We can see that they exist, even if we can't read them.
Exactly. Or we can read them partially,
Mm-hmm.
but they affect us. I mean, we have a strong sense for space, as I said before, and we read them. We might not be able to translate them, but we have a feeling of their meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And their meaning goes beyond what the architect wanted. The architect is like a filmmaker. The architect might have wanted to create, a beautiful building that that makes propaganda for the king who built it or whatever. But on another level, he's maybe telling a different story, or the building is telling a different story. I mean, one of the constants in all cultures on Earth is ghosts. You know, in pretty much every culture there are ghosts in stories, and the big question is why is that? Is there really evidence for ghosts? You know, and I don't think it's I don't think it's so surprising that there are ghosts in all those story universes because it's basically the things that haunt us because they are unresolved things. Ghosts are unresolved things, and that's the same thing in cities. There are unresolved things that haunt us. I mean, so we are affected very much by things we don't understand. Maybe the most affected by things we don't understand.
I find it really interesting what you say about that things from the past look at us and we are no longer really able to see what's their meaning, to understand their meaning. For me, it's always something I highly appreciate when it comes to film history. That film history is great. I mean, also, of course, when I read a novel that's 100 years old or 200 years old, of course, that's also the same effect. But with film, it's even more because you can see the things, you can see the objects. And it's like really looking at the past and realizing that there's a difference to the present. And that means that I might not totally understand it. There is sort of like a strange world, but it's there. And it also means that sort of like the present is up to future changes, that there's going to happen something in the future, and then the moment we're in will no longer be there and will be different. And I think it's a great way to experience difference.
I mean, in many ways, culture is nothing else but trying to translate or trying to connect with the foreign or the other, and that's how we realize who we are, by seeing the difference. And this is why film history is so rich and such a enriching experience for me, because you learn so much about yourself by looking in the mirror of the past as the present. Is another question.
Once you're talking about understanding something wrong, and then you were talking about not understanding something, do you find it is it an issue for you to separate those concepts, or is it synonymous for you? understanding something wrong and not understanding something.
No, it's something different.
Because you said you find it very necessary to understand something wrong, and then you elaborated more on the point understanding something not. So the second point is more clear to me than the first point. What you mean by the first point, understanding something wrong? Why is it so important?
Well, I mean, if you look at the city, for example, I mean, there's all kinds of streams of if you want to put it simply, of words that are hitting you, and some of them you mistake for others, and some of them you don't get at all. I mean, it's communication is never a very it's always a messy thing. A lot of things are being lost. Some are lost entirely. Some are lost in ways that are productive. I mean, most of innovation comes from mistakes being made. Most of innovation is basically misunderstanding, is trying to find a way to India and then you, and so on. I mean, so, but I'm not sure if I
think so.
understood. Yeah, and there's another question.
First of all, thank you. It totally makes sense for me. I didn't know that you studied architecture, and also when I think about Milchwald, I understand now a bit more this like gaze. And I have to think about like one reference the whole time, and it's Jacques Tati, Modern Times. Is this the right title also? And how Tati, or in the movie, like architecture is shown as something that like it's something strange, new, and it's a contradiction of people or like natural life. And in your movie, you seem to, for me, or what's the feeling also when I've seen Unter mir die Stadt, there is this kind of, you show that the city or like modernity became already a part of us, and there is no like kind of separation. And I had the feeling also when it became, especially like when I remember to the critiques, that many people had like problems with it, that there is no the distance, that the people like the things to show are very cold and the materiality is very cold. And why you watch it, because the camera also doesn't take any perspective, even when it comes to the characters you show and to the personal dramas that are developed. So would you think that there is, I don't know, for me, this like feeling of uncanny, this not taking a position, is it something that was important for you, like linking it also to the things that you show?
I'm not sure if I understood your question, but the uncanny is something I'm very much interested, because that's what we are talking about, the other. I mean, if something, and that's one of the power, that's one of the most powerful things that cinema can do, is to show objects as alien, and that's how we realize how strange we live, how strange our lives are organized, how strange the spaces are, and so on. So if you show a glass of water, they are strange in cinema, because you're never able in real life to have this intensified, channeled look at a glass of water. But in cinema you can show it in a way like Scorsese does in Taxi Driver, citing Godard and so on. Suddenly this glass becomes a strange thing that speaks about us, you know. I mean, so of course I'm interested in the uncanny, and I love Jacques Tati, by the way, and his approach to, or his ridicule of modernism, which he at the same time loved. I mean, as you can see in his films, that he was passionate about this kind of new form, and at the same time he was very realistic about it, what their failures are. But I don't know if and let's maybe just continue.
Yeah. I would love to show another excerpt, this time from the most recent film, The Lies of the Victors, Die Lügen der Siege. And it's also a special take on Berlin, the city in which the film is set. And it's also interesting because of the music. I think the music was already in the clip we just saw, in the outtake we just saw. The music plays a decisive role, and I think we should talk about the music too. But first of all, the excerpt from The Lives of the Victors, and it's also towards the end of the film. Just 2 words about the film for those who are not familiar with it. It's about an investigative journalist researching a story, and without him realizing, he's being manipulated. So the story he's researching is more or less a fake story, but
tailored for him.
Tailored for him, yeah. And at the end of the film, he starts to realize that, and then there's happening what we are going to see now. it's a very rich scene. There's a lot to it, and maybe we could start with a music aspect. You've been working for quite a while with a composer, Benedikt Schiefe, and I think you have a very special approach to the composing, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the most unusual aspect to it is probably that usually in film music, the composer starts a work once the edit is more or less finished. And that's different with us. He writes his music before I shoot. So basically he's interpreting the script or the story and is following his musical instinct, so to speak. And then later he produces a lot of material, and later in the editing we try out the material he has produced, and actually try to find things that ignite or explode together, or where there's some that I want the music to first of all to be independent in a way from the image, and secondly, I only want to use it if it heightens our attention to a new level, so to speak, and without being in a master-slave relation, so that the music would serve the audience and tell the audience what to think or feel, and so on. So that's the main difference. And in I don't know. I don't know, for all of you who don't know the film, it's basically the crucial every person has a weakness, and his weakness is in the film is he has diabetes, and it is dependent on this technical device that we see briefly in this sequence, that gives him his the reader, his blood sugar reader, basically, and they manipulate his blood sugar reader, so he has he's wrong dosing. He's using the wrong dosage of his medicine to stabilize his blood sugar.
And there's sort of like a very brief insert in the scene where you can see a head from behind, very dark, and then the frame of glasses and the computer screen. So that is a way of sort of like making something visible, which maybe is not so easily made visible.
Exactly. I mean, one of the problems of this sequence is also that a lot of people don't get it because it looks like a mobile phone. And anyway, when we read that the most of the medical devices are quite easy to hack into, and that you can actually affect not only diabetes readers and so on, but also heart, how you call it, pacemakers and so on. So you basically can manipulate any electronic device, and then we thought it would be it's a nice image for our fragility, or for the effect that we can all be affected by electronic manipulation, and the link to his blood seemed to be very rich for cinematic use. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then there's something else which is very rich in terms of cinematographic potential, which is the gambling scene and the way you shoot it, or the way you work together with the DOP, Reinhard Vorschneider, with whom you worked for the first time? Second time, sorry. Maybe you could sort of like talk a little bit about the gambling and the way it is filmed, because the way the camera moves is very is in a way unique, very special. You can. It's not an invisible camera that wants to be forgotten. It's a camera which is very self-conscious.
It basically follows this pattern of what we now are used of technical eyes, like the scanner. You know, the scanner that has a movement that is not human, and we imitated the scanning movement, and because we for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that we understand that it's a technical logic, that it's following, it's not gracing the characters. I mean, usually camera movement is motivated by the movement of character, and so usually camera is gracing the character by moving with him or her. So in that respect, it values the character in a way that seemed old-fashioned to us. So we try to find a camera movement language, so to speak, that is beyond the character, which is exactly what happens with technology today. I mean, it's not any longer about one individual who takes a decision, makes a decision, but it's really about algorithms and you name it. So we thought it could be interesting to tell a variety of scenes, not only this scene, in this kind of scanning shot where you have no idea if what we see is the decisive moment or not. Because, you know, I mean, the big ideology in image making in the 19th century and cinema is very much a higher of this tradition. The big ideology was that we would be able to reconstruct the decisive moment, the moment when Caesar decides to cross the Rubicon, and the moment when Napoleon decides to return to his troops, and the moment, and so on. I mean, this decisive moment, and that cinema or painting can privilege the viewer in that way to say, look at this. This is how history was made. And now, if we show scenes and happenings more like arbitrarily, you begin to doubt that, first of all, it's really about decisions, and that you you are really responsible for your fate, so to speak. So it becomes, in a way, a fatalistic aesthetics, or at least that was the idea behind it. But there's also an element of chance, because I mean the movement back, which is much faster than that came. That was actually an accident, not an accident in making, but my key grip man, he did that as a so-called working tracking, not meant to be used, you know. But when I saw it in the editing, I thought it's so beautiful, this kind of that movement that is clearly too fast to show anything specific, you know. So we decided to use it.
And I think it's also beautiful because it's not only if it were always like the camera is moving from the panning is going sort of like from the right to the left, and then you have a cut, and then it's again from the right to the left. I think it's great to have this moment of variation, and also the speed thing is very interesting. What I also found very interesting is that the action is taking place in the background of the image, and you really have, in a way, you have to focus and to reflect a lot about upon what you are seeing in order to get it, and maybe you don't even get it, as you said. Like there are maybe not key moments. There are some gestures that might mean something,
but you can't be sure if you have seen the important thing. And this is actually what I like, because that's what I think is contemporary. I mean, in terms of we don't know what's also politically, we don't know what will be important in hindsight. So we see our time as something quite chaotically, and in hindsight we will be able to spin a narrative, but here and now we are not.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know if this is important or this is important. So it's rather uncontrollable,
Mm-hmm.
and we try to mimic that, this kind of uncontrollable time.
Which is of course a challenge, because at the same time you are constructing a narration with your film, so it's you have the hindsight already in a way, but at the same time you're trying to create an atmosphere in which this option of constructing something that makes sense in retrospective is not there.
Yeah, and that involves, hopefully, I mean, the gamble was to involve the audience in a way that the audience would feel responsible to, first of all, see that all is a construction, and secondly, construct the construction, so to speak. I don't know if we succeeded, but that was the challenge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd like to, unless there's a question.
And shortly before for your question, because one of our my feeling was that in Germany, at least, I don't know how it's in Belgium, but in Germany, people seem to me to have a very naturalistic idea of how news are being made, you know, in terms of not so much that it's constructed, but that important things are being told through the media, and so my emphasis was to show that it's pretty much everything is construction in news and in politics, and we shouldn't take anything as a natural thing.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether your talk was about the whole scene you were showing, or just the gambling scene, because I would rather associate your points to the gambling scene and to the special vertical movement of the camera than to the rather remix technique, which I associated with the Requiem for a Dream technique. So
it's
were
true.
you talking about mainly the gambling, or is it crucial to see the remix scenes before?
It's right. We were mainly talking about the gambling part of the montage, whereas before it's more of this kind we discussed before, like the city that is fractured in so many realities and so many buildings and stories and so on, and just to give a glimpse, it's basically built as an echo chamber for what happened before, so that when we hit the streets, we see that there are people who will be affected by the story.
Mm-hmm. I had a question in mind that relates to the first part of what we just saw, which has to do with a light effect you're using quite often in this film, which is the lens flare and sort of like the colors. And I find it, again, it's something which is really sort of like outstanding in the film, the way you use that. And if you could tell us what was your motivation to do so, why you wanted to have this effect.
Because basically it's a story about distortion. optical distortion is kind of a equivalent on an image level, what the story is about. Of course, it's nothing new. Lens flares are being used widely in Hollywood movies these days. But it's quite interesting probably to go back to where this means of expression comes from. And it's basically part of the 60s revolution in cinema, where you could, through new technology, which was much lighter and portable, you could go outside, shoot on the streets and so on. So the 60s revolution brought in a certain flaws in recording. And a lens flare in the beginning was nothing but a recording flaw, because if you don't have a big compendium to cover out the light, then the light can hit parts of the lens that are not supposed to be hit. You know, so the lens flare is basically a flaw, and it became synonymous with a certain immediacy. Because this flaw was first seen in films in documentary films, or in films that were shot low budget on the street and so on. So this immediacy is still part of this lens flare, even if it's only the remains of a tradition that is long forgotten, so to speak.
Because here, obviously, it's a very constructed lens flare.
Right. We produced it. Yeah. And it was fun to seduce Reinhold Vorschneider, who is a cinematographer known for very strict cinema, to seduce him to play around, you know, with cranes and stuff. It's nice.
Yeah, I think the result is really convincing, really great. But I was wondering about that, because he really is known for severe might not be the right word, but for quite an austere style, to put it like that. And I guess, but I don't know. Did he enjoy?
Very much.
Yeah. I would like to show another outtake of The Lies of the Victors that describes again the whole surveillance thing and the manipulation thing. I mean, we've already got sort of like an idea of that with that short, very brief insert of the head and the glasses and the computer screen. But I'd like to show another scene in which you approach the subject matter from another angle, from another perspective.
Und der Akku?
Kann man nicht rausnehmen.
Ja, richtig.
Ich freue mich, dass Sie hier sind.
Freuen Sie sich mal nicht zu früh.
Okay, das heißt?
No. Die Akte ist wieder aufgetaucht.
Mit den Belegen für die Schwarzenkasse?
Ja.
Das Geld, das die Kranken gesund macht.
Ja, könnte man so sagen.
Ja, das ist die Story.
Ist da noch was drin für mich?
Dazu müsste ich mal was sehen. Wann können Sie es denn mal mitbringen?
In 2 Tagen.
Gleiche Zeit, gleicher Ort?
Ja.
This happens relatively at the beginning of the film, and the main character, the journalist, meets an informant who has been working for the German army, but there's a third somebody we don't know exactly who that could be, that brings in another perspective.
Right. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's black and white, and of course, modern surveillance is not black and white anymore. But we thought, or we saw the need to differentiate it in a clearer way. We had it in color before, so to make a point that this is not the perspective of the narrator, so to speak, but an extra narrator. So, yeah, it was produced with it was not produced with a hand camera and not hand operated, but we had a electronic device that would follow the people and so on, but it was too perfect. So we decided to that we have to make it less perfect to make a point, you know. I don't know if that's very interesting for you, but no.
Well, I think when it comes to surveillance, of course, there are great films that, like The Conversation. Did you have anything in mind? Did you sort of like when you conceived the way how you were going to represent it, how you were going to film it? Did you think of something special, or was it sort of like more intuitive the way you approached it?
No, I mean, The Conversation is a good starting point, because it's a film that I love a lot and I like a lot, and also. I mean, the beginning of The Conversation with this very long lens and the dialogue that is being reconstructed over the course of the whole film. There's a clear similarity or clear link to that film by Francis Coppola. I planned to do this sequence technically quite differently. That was, for boring reason, it didn't happen, but I actually wanted to shoot it I didn't want to pan with it, but I would rather have recorded the whole thing in a master shot and then have motion design a program that would just follow the motion within this this master shot. So it would have been clear that the movement is something. The movement of the camera is something of a reframing of one frame,
mm-hmm.
Which would be closer to the real situation of a surveillance camera. But anyway. I don't know if I have much to say about it.
I think it's definitely interesting that you have sort of like two levels at this moment: the level of the narrator, or the level of sort of like the camera of your film, and then the extra camera. And I think having two levels at the same time is something which happens also on different levels in this film. For instance, when it comes to what's really happening and what's happening in the fantasy, and there's a very beautiful scene in which the main character, the journalist, talks to another journalist he's working with, and they are both doing research on the same case. She is younger; she is an apprentice, and they are talking about. I think they are meeting. They are in his apartment or in her apartment. I don't know exactly. And they are standing in the hallway, and they are talking about the case. And suddenly we see them kissing, and then it's back to him in the frame of the door, her in another door frame, and they are talking. And then suddenly we can see them kissing again, and that happens like 3 or 4 times, or maybe even 5. And it's confusing because you don't know exactly what's happening. Are they now are they now starting to make out? I mean, you could sense before that there was some tension between them, but you wouldn't be able to tell. And then it happens all of a sudden, and until you realize, oh, it's all in his head. And normally it's very difficult in film to show what's in somebody's head, unless it's a dream sequence, unless it's something sort of like marked as a fantasy. And I think that is something also very characteristic for this film, that you change between the two levels, between the level of what's really happening and the level of what's happening in his head, like without any kind of mediation.
Yeah. Well, I think this is really something I'm very much interested in, because I think our lives are so much about fiction. I mean, constantly we undress someone in our heads, or we imagine to hit him or whatever, you know. I mean, we are constantly in fiction and reality at the same time, and we are constantly, for example, trying out what I could say, and then we don't say it, and so on. And there's a beautiful film by Nick Rugg. It's called Bad Timing. It's with Art Garfunkel and Teresa Russell. It's set in Vienna, and it's very interesting in terms of how it's edited, because there you see what he wants to say but doesn't say. So we would see and hear lines that then we see he doesn't use, you know. So and this, it's edited in a way that we understand that it's not happening, but it could have happened. Mm-hmm. And this kind of potentiality is something I'm very much interested in. And also, I mean, the seamless in alternation between the real and the half real, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Because the reality in our heads is of course real too, but it's not action, you know. Mm-hmm. So I'm currently working, among other things, on a film where people are involved in watching other people's dreams as an entertainment, and where then the question arises if those things that are in the dreams can swap or can contaminate the reality. So, mm-hmm. So this it's a kind of fantasy film.
Mm-hmm. There's another film of yours, Falscher Bekenner. I'm blanking on the international title. Help me, please.
Yeah, I'm Guilty was the suggestion of the American distributor.
Yeah, it's not really what Falscher Bekenner means, and I think there's something happening where the line between fantasy, what is fantasy and what is really happening, I mean on the level of the film narration, is very blurry. I was confused oftentimes. Maybe I could show one last outtake to sort of like show what I have in mind when I'm talking about it, and that is an outtake which is.
It's not an outtake. An outtake would be something that you throw away.
No, I don't think so.
No?
Oh, well, however, a clip, excerpt, and it's at the beginning of the film, and it finds a sort of like. There is a solution at the end of the it's two sequences, so after a while you know where you are, or at the end you know where you are and what has happened. But then there are other moments in the film where where you can't be sure, and maybe let's see the clip and then we'll talk about it. Could you keep it for later, actually? I think we still have time, but not too much, and let's see.
So it's the very beginning of the film, which is about a boy who becomes what in German is called Trittbrettfahrer, someone who confesses things that he hasn't done in order to, I don't know, in order to be more important, to seem more important, and in the film, during the film, he more and more confuses himself what he has done and what not, and with his own confusion, the film becomes more and more ambivalent about if he has done anything or not.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, here what happens is sort of like the very beginning night highway car accident could be real, but then you see him waking up, and that normally is a clear indicator of that what you've seen before is a dream. And then you have the panning shot that also sort of like shows us his room, and so you can see a little bit like about his surrounding and his environment. And it's a panning shot I think a similar panning shot is used in the beginning of The Lies of the Victors, only that you can sort of like see the whole apartment. And then you think, okay, that has been a dream, but then the camera stops and you can see the object that had been there before, and the hand taking hold of the object. And I find this really interesting because it's sort of like a roller coaster or something like that. You think it's a dream. First of all, you think it's real, then you think it's a dream, and then you realize, oh, it must have been real when the object is there. And later on, there are moments where you're really not, you can't really know if they are really happening.
because I mean, later on, some things are really contradictory to the other. I mean, so the more he believes in his own guilt, the more contradictions there are produced, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And the object is like a magical object that brings I don't know, the spark of this idea to steer his life in another direction. It's a steering. It's part of the steering. This Lenkstange. The magical object in a way forces him to go this other path, or to follow this other path. Like the black monolith in 2001 or something.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Later on, we have these scenes which take place in a I think it's maybe a gas station at the highway, or sort of like one of these
toilet.
It's a public toilet next to the highway. And he meets with a lot of motorcycle drivers, and they engage in sexual activity. And that was something which is really sort of like not connected to the rest of the film, until suddenly, towards the end of the film, there's this moment when one of the motorcycle drivers visits him at home, and even his parents show up. So it seems to be, then it becomes like very real, but before you have these, that's the ambivalence you were talking about.
Right, I mean, once you start to believe in your own fantasies, the fantasies can also interfere with your life in a way that you can't control. I mean, once you cut the connection between cause and effect, then everything is possible. And this is basically what the film is about. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, in our lives, in all our lives, I think cause and effect have a romantic relationship, meaning that we want them to be together. Whereas in real life, evidence is not hard enough to know what caused what effect, I mean, in many ways. I mean, okay, if the street is wet, we assume it has rained. That's pretty basic. But in many other circumstances, you see a person turning her back towards you, and you understand, oh, she doesn't like me, you know. Maybe it didn't mean anything, but from this assumption, she turned the back. You react to her differently the next time, and then she will, you know, and so on. In many ways, our fictions create a reality, and vice versa, and that's what that's something that interests me a lot. In how far the fictions we create and we need, so to speak, have a price, and in how far we have to suffer for fictions that are not not justified in any other way but by our own desires and fantasies and needs.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's always something definitely real about fantasies and dreams and desires. Are you oftentimes confronted with critical reactions from people who are used to a more realistic and traditional storytelling?
Well, sure. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I said don't trust the director, because often people want me to clarify and say, what does it really mean? And I don't want to be the person who sanctifies certain interpretations and so on. But yeah, I mean, for some it's frustrating, and for some it's interesting.
I think we could go on, but I just received signs that time is nearly up. Maybe we could take in one or two last questions, if there are, over there.
Who is your biggest inspiration?
I have to say there are so many. But if I'm hard pressed to name only one, I'd say Ernst Lubitsch, the German Jewish director of films like Die Austernprinzessin or Madame du Barry, or I'm especially fond of his American films like Trouble in Paradise, Design for Living, Shop Around the Corner, To Be or Not to Be. So he's a great hero for me. But there's so many, so I don't know. It's unjust to name only one.
The clip you were discussing before. You found some issues to talk about different levels. My question of different levels is this a surveillance of a surveillance scene? Because I knew the media as the fourth power, or it's known as the fourth power, which is surveying the other three. But in this scene, it's self-surveyed, and it's making not such a good figure. And I don't know the film, but I can imagine it's throughout the film. So is there, from your political remark, that this power is declining, and how do you find it? Is there some comment perhaps on this? And is there by the decline of another surveillance power, which is probably not in one of the first three as well, but in the commercial rather?
Yeah, I think it's at least challenged very hard and harshly. The media is challenged, and that's a good thing in part, because we need to wake up and be responsible and to question certain stories. But it's mainly a bad thing, because media is being played and being used, and there are very sophisticated players in the field with a lot of money who use media to gain influence and make money. And I think the most recent developments in the US is a very good example of how media gone corrupt can cause a lot of can create a lot of problems that politically we will all have to suffer for them. I mean, if you look at Trump, I mean, it's very obvious, but he spent so little money in comparison. but he gained so much coverage, and he was so present in this election. But 99% of this press coverage was not about content. It was not about his policies. So it's very much challenged, and the film tries to shed some light on the vulnerabilities of the press as an entity that is very much under economic pressure these days and has to scale back massively and is more vulnerable than ever towards manipulation, I think, especially in digital times, so to speak. But maybe you feel encouraged to see the film. I would love to have you seen it.
I highly recommend it. I think it will be shown on the 21st or on the 22nd of December. Please check the program of Cinematek. It's really, as I said, highly recommendable to watch it. It's a great experience. And all the other films too. As I said before, The City Below will be shown at 7. That is like in 15 minutes. And afterwards we will open the cycle Homecomming with Alexander Kluge's film. And thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much, Christoph, for your remarks and for your interventions. Great that you're here. And well, yeah, have a great evening and come back.
Thank you.